say to you, Berta, why don't you just talk a little bit from your heart about your personal journey and how it connected to Hearing Voices, and then we'll see where we go from there.
And I'm really filled with joy to be here and to see people who I really know and people I don't know. I'm grateful that you're here. And I'm really grateful for what Mark said about the space between us, because that has really become a very important way for me to think about myself in relation to other people, to other movements and communities. And it's very different from how I grew up, which was very isolated with a family that really didn't look to outside the family for support. And so part of my journey was a journey into connection. And that connection is something that I really experienced in Montgomery County. And I hadn't had that kind of experience before. I think I've been hearing voices, at least voices with words, since 1966. I think that when a 16-year-old today has an experience that feels different, there's a possibility that they'll get the same response that I did, which was to see me as a problem, to see me as something that needed fixing. But there's also a chance that they might be in a space where people might just be curious about what their experience is and what it means to them, and be somebody willing to listen without swooping in to fix. My journey with Hearing Voices was about my experience of being different. And my voices, one of the things, sometimes voices carry beliefs. A lot of what I talk about has to do with a frame of understanding, a narrative. So there is the narrative that Mark mentioned coming from Robert Whitaker when he was quoting the Quakers. These days there's the frame of looking at people who are different, troubled or troubling, as needing to be helped or managed or controlled. And that's not so different from how I was seen. But the thing is at 16, I was really struggling, and to be seen at all was important. It was like a lifeline. It's just a shame that the lifeline defined me as so individually pathological. At 16, we're all looking for building an identity. And it's so, we really can encourage people to explore, or we can give them holes to try to fit in. So part of my journey was I was given a hole that I may have been square, but I was pushed into it, and it was an explanation for my difference that I accepted. So the idea was it was very much an individual issue. It wasn't to do with the social context I was in, my family, the politics of the day. It was just something that was going to need to be fixed in me. And I would say for most of the following decades, I accepted that narrative. There were some exceptions. There were some times when I really tried to develop some alternative. But really, from 1966 to 2008, I accepted that I was the problem. And I did some stuff in between, you know, I supported a lot of other people. But basically, much of that time I did it keeping who I was a secret. And that made it really hard to be present and intimate with people, because I was having to protect them from who I was. I have to say that in terms of Hearing Voices Network, I might never have discovered it had I not been asked to support someone else. Because I really am I was raised female in this culture. I was raised to help other people, regardless of what context I was in. So when I got the notion of the recovery movement of the 90s, because I had been a little involved in the 70s with the ex-patients liberation movement, but in the 90s, I finally got the message about that Pat Deegan was saying that people have a right to have a life of meaning and purpose. And so in 2007, I took a training because I was teaching horseback riding to people in a day program in North Philadelphia. And Philadelphia was starting a recovery transformation. So I was teaching about horses to people in this day program, and they started telling me what they were learning about the recovery movement. And so they got me into learning about the recovery movement of the 90s. And it told me that I didn't have to wait till I wasn't hearing voices to really have a life. I was still, all of those years, working with people who really were trying to help me and giving me lots and lots of psychiatric help that I had to get rid of my experience, which they considered symptoms, before I could take the next step. And what I learned in this first course that I took was that the average length of time for people in pre-vocational programs that were psychiatric programs was 40 years. So we never really got into work and building a full life because we had to do this hurdle of suppressing our symptoms before we could move to the next step. So I learned that I could leap ahead regardless of what my experience was. And I was still afraid of my experience of voices. But I wanted to get back into more work. Work had always been very important to me. I was on disability, but I was working part-time, mostly with horses and people. So when I got hooked up with Betsy Gorski at creating, well, it wasn't creating Increased Connections, it was Consultants in Context. And because I had both lived experience and a master's degree, she was interested in interviewing me. She hired me for 3 hours a week. And that was the most important thing that happened to me in decades. And because I heard voices, and because I learned to start talking about my experience as I learned about becoming a peer and not being the social worker, people started saying, well, this person in this program is having problems with voices, and they think that maybe you could be support, help them stay out of the hospital. And I had to face the fact that all of the growing I had been doing, I still felt totally powerless when it came to my experience of voices. And I knew that if I tried to support someone the way I had been supported for the past 40 years, I couldn't do that. I felt subordinate to my voices. They were all powerful. And yeah, they were letting me do 3 hours of work, but they were letting me. So they were dominant, just like the idea of us being pathologically, individually the problem. That's a dominant narrative in our culture that I had swallowed and that had swallowed me. So I didn't want to bring that to somebody who had a chance to have a life. So in 2007, I heard about Inner Voice, but I hadn't used the computer much at all because I'd been doing horses, and when I went to graduate school, they had no, they just had big mainframes. They had no personal computers. So I had trouble finding inner voice. I heard about it in 2007 at a Montgomery County training. It was just in like a tiny piece of it, but I really heard it. So by 2008, I was using the computer and I connected with Inner Voice, which is the international community for hearing voices, and I started reading. That led me to reading, and it led me to working to recovery because they were selling the books, and they were a big connection. I got to know Karen Taylor, who's married to Ron Coleman, and both of them have trained here a lot. Because the first thing I ordered from them, I'd never ordered on the computer before, and it duplicated it. I came back with, this is what I ordered, 2 of everything, and I thought, oh my God, I can never afford this. And I'm writing quickly to her. I didn't mean it, I just wanted 1. And that was my first relationship, because Karen then knew people in the States and gave me contacts to me. So basically, I was really nourished by the people internationally and by reading. I was a slow learner. I didn't read till partway through the 2nd grade. But once I learned to read, that was really an avenue of power for me. And so I learned. And it was somewhat of a struggle at first, because I still really thought if I just could get rid of my voices, I wouldn't need to learn about this new movement, and I could support somebody staying out of the hospital.